Next up is the GPR V4 steering stabilizer. This install did require moving the tank back a few inches to access the ignition bolts. I timed it when I was pulling the tank anyway for new spark plugs. The install directions are clear and you can download them ahead of purchase from GPR to see if you can handle the install yourself. The hardest part is getting out the stock ignition screws. Using a rotary tool, you can cut a slot in the head of the screw to allow a flathead screwdriver to get in there and try and spin them out. You need to make these cuts as deep as possible because the heads are super soft and won't hold up for much force. These bolts also have thread locker on them from the factory. If you're not able to use the slot method, just grind the heads off, then use vice grips to get them out of the way once the ignition is moved. You also need to cut out the key side of the ignition cover, which is pretty straightforward. Before starting, you should also mark your handlebar on both the inside and outside of each riser. The new risers in the kit are spaced differently, so you don't have any reference points for getting your bars back to center. The kit comes with new risers. They're not a perfect match to the stock bosses in terms of how they're shaped. However, the fit is excellent and the kit is high quality. One note is the V4 unit comes stock with a heavier street bias oil. At first I thought it was a bit stiff and spoke to GPR's customer service, who was excellent. They offered to swap out the oil for a lightweight oil that they use in their more off-road oriented units, with a quick turnaround and at no cost. I didn't take them up on this yet because once they used it for a week, it actually felt much better. In that first week I was having some floating on the rear in deep sand and deep gravel, but I think it was mostly that I needed to get the bars centered and in better position for the new 3/4 inch rise that it added. With the bars out of position, my weight was too far forward. Once I made these changes, it feels good everywhere. I still may have it changed out for a lighter oil, but I may wait till it needs a rebuild. What would be great is if Triumph would cut a deal with GPR to install the bracket on the ignition at the factory. This wouldn't add much cost, but would make the install a pure bolt-on. I think people thinking about installing these are worried about snapping off an ignition bolt during install and being left with a broken bolt in there. But okay, maybe that was just me that had that fear. I installed the unit for a few reasons. First, on unpaved desert roads and 2-track, you can clip a rock at speed because they'll protrude up out of the dirt, sometimes with some sand in front of them, so you may not even see them. The damper will help to keep the bar from being ripped out of your hand. Next, on sand, the Tiger's steering angle is pretty steep, and it's a top-heavy bike, so slowing the sway of the wheel makes the front feel much more stable, in my opinion. Now keep in mind, I don't have a dirt riding background, and I'm not great in sand, so the damper is more than anything covering for my lack of skill while I adjust the throttle and correct my balance. I also like the extra resistance in low-speed tight turns when I'm standing up. Normally, if you lose balance in this position, there's no resistance pushing back on you. Now with that extra resistance, you have more time to correct your balance. Off the bars, I've used a Ram ball mount and arm connected to my own locking 3D printed GPS holder design. It's under wraps for now because I may look into marketing the design in the future if there's demand for it. 3D printers are awesome, by the way, if you have some CAD skills. The GPS is a Garmin GPS Map 64 ST. I like my design for the cradle for a few reasons over the Ram version. The holder is plastic, so a thief could pry it out with some effort, but for trips into a store to grab lunch or supplies, I can just leave it locked in place. I can also take it in and out while plugged in, versus the Ram cradle, which, if I remember right, you need to seat in the cradle and then plug in. It's supported on the top, bottom, and sides, so I doubt it would ever pop out in a crash, or at least a crash where my biggest concern would be, hey, where'd that GPS go? Powering the GPS and my phone is a 2-port USB outlet off the DIN plug. That's the plug that Europeans use that's a little smaller than a cigarette lighter. have a custom little bracket to hold it in place, so I can plug and unplug easily while riding. The phone sits in a Ram X cradle. I put some Velcro on there, with the soft side on the back of the phone case, just for a little extra hold security. Also, the GPS app I run on the phone is Locus Map. There's a free or paid version. I think the paid version was $10. You can download maps offline, import and export tracks. You can even create tracks on routable maps. That means it follows the road, even the dirt ones, so you get the curves in the road rather than a series of straight lines. I usually run them both in at different zoom levels. The phone can be tough to see because the backlighting isn't as bright as the Garmin, and it also ends up with fingerprints on it. But the phone is a lot easier to find things on by typing or talking versus this type of Garmin unit. Next, I've installed heated grips and fog lights. The heated grips, as well as the switch that controls both the grips and the fog lights, are Triumph parts from Hermes Triumph. They have a great customer service and a good website. I did this because Triumph already figured out the wire links and connectors, so the install is much easier. The grip kit is part number A9638170, and the cube switch kit is A9828031. The grip kit includes a single switch, which I didn't need, since I got the double switch kit to allow for the fog lights. The install is straightforward and comes with good directions from Triumph's instructions website. You do need to be comfortable with pulling apart your switch gear, carefully pulling wires, and pulling body panels. The only complaint is the switches illuminate on their outer rim when on, but it can be hard to see in the direct sunlight, so you may need to hold a hand over it in order to shade it enough to see if it's on or not. For the fog lights, I opted for some cheap 12-watt spot LEDs off Amazon. They're not the brightest, and if I were riding off-road at night often, I'd opt for something a bit more powerful. I got these more to be seen in traffic, and to add some light on dark mountain roads. I chose spot over flood, and have them aimed so that they light from the center to the right, so they're not glaring into oncoming cars. They help me see bumps in the road and any animal like deer off to the right. I matched up the stock connectors and ordered kits from Cycle Terminal in New Jersey. Mine were EconoSeal-J MK2s, and I needed to order 2 male and 2 female kits. Check your bike's connectors against the drawings of these parts available online to confirm before ordering. The connectors use some waterproof silicone seals, so you need to make sure you get the pins in and fully seated. Download the instructions from the manufacturer to make sure the pin is inserted with the correct side up, or it won't lock in place. And I had to pull them through by gripping the pin tips with needle nose pliers. Once this was done, I was able to mount them up and under and run the wires over the plastic panels on each side of the radiator. They're mounted using some aluminum brackets from Amazon to my upper crash bars. The upper crash bars are from Hepco and Becker. They mount through the fairings, so you will need to pull them if you're doing any pulling of the fairings. But each side only uses 2 bolts, one at the fairing and one under the beak. They mount to the engine, and I don't use thread locker on them or over torque them. In a drop, I'd rather have them shift to dissipate some impact. But this makes it more likely the bolts could loosen, so I check them occasionally. I figure the threads are long enough that if they do shake loose, I'll notice long before they back out far enough. I run the stock lower crash bars. On the brake side upper crash bar, I've mounted my NoPro. That's what I call a cheap knockoff GoPro. It's a Cobra HD, can shoot 1080p, and costs less than $30. I leave it on the bike regularly when hiking. It wouldn't be comfortable doing that with a pricey action camera. It generally does okay, but does get a lot of wind noise. And also it's susceptible to strong sunlight, and you'll see some solar glare on it. When I want it on, I just plug it into the USB cable socket. It starts and stops recording when power is added and removed. You can control it from your phone by Wi-Fi, but the app is pretty bad. The stock XCX skid plate is okay for what I do. AltRider and others make a more durable option, but you'll probably have to drop those for an oil filter change. I did modify the stock plate by drilling 2 holes in front of the oil filter, and then I 3D printed a design out of ABS that does a good job of blocking the filter from debris. If it breaks, I can just print another. This design allows me to just pull 2 very easy to access bolts to change the oil filter. I did remove the charcoal canister, which is required by California emissions rules, so most US bikes will have them. I'm not in California, so make sure you're not breaking your local laws if you pull yours. You may need to remove this for some aftermarket skid plates as well. In my opinion, having these on a bike that may see tip-overs and water crossings is a potential point of failure. If the charcoal is dampened by fuel or water, the purge cycle intended to pull gas fumes back into your engine can pull in a bit of charcoal residue. I think this was more of a problem on some of the BMW F800 GS models, where I believe they were mounted up high. You can Google that if you're interested. This is also the reason why on a car you should never overfill the fuel tank, because you may end up with a check engine light. But on bikes, sometimes we try and get in as much fuel as possible for range. If you do pull yours, you need to plug the purge line. The easiest way to tell the vent line from the purge line is the vent line is open and you can blow air through it, while the purge line is closed, except for when the valve is activated by the ECU. I don't love having an open vent line, because that could also be a source of dirt and dust, but the tank needs to breathe. I restricted mine a bit so it's partially plugged. I do wish Triumph would just put a bypass valve on the canister, so in off-road mode, it wouldn't cycle a purge valve. But to me, the ECU is a black box, so I don't know when it chooses to cycle on and off. Notice also on the coolant hose that runs forward of the shift lever, I have added a hose clamp on it. I do this because the bracket that Triumph uses there can bend and stab into that line, so this protects that a bit. Also, if I was to get a leak, having a hose clamp and a piece of inner tube will probably get you back to civilization. Instead of keeping them in a toolbox, just throw 1 or 2 of these on your hoses, exhaust, or frame. The side stand on the bike is weaker than I'd like. Sometimes in deep 2-track, the best way to turn the bike around is pivoting it around its side stand. I'm not sure the Tiger's side stand would hold up to this. This is about the one time where I'd like a heavier steel piece on the bike. It's also a bit long if you don't have the preload cranked up, so the bike doesn't lean all that much. This can make getting the side stand down and the bike stable difficult if you have a slope on the clutch side. I'm running with a side stand enlarger. Again, I designed it and 3D printed it out of ABS. It's glued on and works great on soft surfaces. The center stand that comes stock with the bike is solid, but very difficult to put the bike on solo. You really have to stand on it and commit, knowing that if you do it right, it won't fall over. In the garage, I roll the rear tire up into some 1-inch or so patio blocks before setting the stand. Also, when taking it off, I strap the front brake to provide some light drag so it comes down slow. I think Triumph knew the stand is taller than it needs to be, but if they made it any shorter, it would interfere with the side stand, because the two just barely clear each other. The shift lever is a folding model off of Touratech. The stock lever does not fold and will bend if you catch it on a rock in 2-track. That stock lever is steel and difficult to bend back when it's still on the bike. This foldable one you can bend back by hand. I'd highly recommend swapping out the stock shift lever. On the rear brake side, I couldn't find a foldable option, although I think the new Scrambler 1200 XE might have folding levers. I used a small piece of coated wire and a link of chain to leash the lever to the lower crash bars. This might help keep the lever from getting ripped away from the bike if it catches a rock when moving forward in a drop. The cases are up high on the Triumph engine, so it's not likely that a lever will ever push in and through the case covers. If you have an Africa Twin, you may want to look at that, because if I recall, those cases are pretty exposed. Next up are the pegs. The rubbers can be pulled from the stock pegs to increase grip, but they're still very narrow. If you're going to be standing for any length of time, get a set of wide pegs. It's a lot less tiring with wide pegs. I'm running the pivot pegs. I like these because over washboard and on hills, they tilt a bit to compensate, and I don't get a pressure point in the front or the back of the peg. But it also takes some getting used to. It does make hitting the levers a bit easier, in my opinion. Some people don't like their movement, so check out some reviews online, but any wide off-road peg will be more comfortable standing on than stock.